I know you have probably watched other videos about lowering blood pressure. You have heard about the foods to eat, the foods to avoid, the vegetables that help, the vegetables that don't, what time to eat them, how to prepare them, and what habits are supposed to make the biggest difference. And maybe some of those recommendations helped. Maybe some didn't. If they worked perfectly, you probably would not be here watching this video. Now, before you assume this is another video claiming that everyone else is wrong and that what I am about to share is somehow the only answer, let me say something important. Medicine has never worked that way. There are different medications used to treat the same illness. What works beautifully for one patient may barely move the needle for another. At the same time, something that changes one person's life may do very little for someone else. Yet both people are being treated for the exact same condition. That reality is not a weakness in medicine. It is simply the reality of human biology. And it is also why scientists continue researching new approaches every single year. If one solution worked perfectly for everyone, research would have stopped decades ago. But it hasn't, because the human body is more complicated than that. Over the years, working with patients over 70, I have learned something that changed the way I think about blood pressure. People often become loyal to one strategy, one medication, one diet, one routine. But the body responds best when we remain curious, informed, and open to evidence. Which brings me to what I want to share with you today. Here is the real reason your blood pressure readings keep climbing, and why every pill, every low-salt meal, every morning walk you have faithfully completed has only managed the numbers without ever addressing the biological machinery underneath them. You have been handed tools that manage the condition. Nobody has explained the condition. And that is exactly what changes today. If you are over 70 and your blood pressure has been trending upward, if you find yourself sitting in the doctor's office, watching that cuff inflate and holding your breath, hoping the numbers do not go higher than last time, then what I am about to share may help you understand your condition in a completely different way. Not because garlic is a miracle, not because any single food replaces medical treatment, but because there is a specific biological mechanism driving blood pressure elevation after 70 that almost no standard appointment has time to explain. My name is Dr. Natalie Brooks. I have spent years watching patients arrive in my office, managing their blood pressure without truly understanding why it continues to rise. And every time I sit with someone who feels as though they are doing everything right while their body seems to be working against them, I think the same thing. This is not failure. This is incomplete information. Before we go any further, tell me your age and country in the comments. And tell me whether your blood pressure has been climbing despite your best efforts. I read every comment because your experiences often reveal patterns that deserve more attention than a 10-minute appointment can provide. This is how you stop guessing. I want to pause here and tell you about an anonymized composite case because I never want to pretend that one person's story proves a treatment. It doesn't. But what a composite case can do is help us recognize a pattern that many older adults describe. I will call him Robert. Robert was 73 years old, retired, disciplined, the kind of person who followed instructions carefully. He took his medication. He checked his blood pressure regularly. He reduced sodium. He walked most mornings. And yet the numbers continued drifting upward, especially after dinner and often the following morning. For years, he assumed he simply needed more medication. What he did not realize was that his blood vessels were changing in ways nobody had ever explained to him. That question eventually brought him into my office. Why was it still going up? That question is the entire reason this video exists, because here is what almost nobody explains about blood pressure after 70. The conventional approach focuses on what the blood is doing, but aging changes what the blood vessels are doing, and that distinction matters. The first change is arterial stiffening. The second is nitric oxide decline. The third is chronic low-grade vascular inflammation. These three biological changes are responsible for much of the blood pressure elevation we see later in life. But before I explain how garlic interacts with these mechanisms, let me ask you something. Do you check your blood pressure in the morning? Most people do. But here is what almost nobody talks about. What happens to your blood pressure while you are asleep? For many adults over 70, blood pressure does not fall the way it should during the night. Instead of giving the heart a period of recovery, it remains elevated. Sometimes it even spikes. This condition is known as nocturnal hypertension, and it is one of the most underdiagnosed patterns I see. While a person sleeps peacefully, the heart may still be working overtime. The arteries remain under stress, and the next morning they wake feeling tired without understanding why. The troubling part is that a normal morning reading may not reveal what happened overnight. That is one reason understanding the biology beneath blood pressure matters so much, because the numbers are only telling part of the story. This is exactly where garlic enters the conversation. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. Garlic is unique in its own way. It is not magic. It is not a cure. And it certainly is not a replacement for the medications your doctor may have prescribed. But what makes garlic so interesting is that it appears to influence several of the exact biological mechanisms we have just discussed. That is what caught my attention when I first began reviewing the research. Not because it promised miracles, because it made biological sense. And when something makes biological sense and is supported by clinical evidence, I pay attention. Garlic, known scientifically as Allium sativum, has been used for thousands of years across cultures that never communicated with one another. Ancient Egyptians used it. Traditional Chinese medicine used it. Ancient Greek physicians used it. Long before scientists could explain why, people simply observed that it seemed to support circulation, vitality, and cardiovascular health. Today we understand far more about what may be happening beneath the surface. The key compound is called allicin, and this is the part that genuinely excited me when I first read the research. Allicin is not present in an intact garlic clove. It forms only when garlic is crushed or chopped. That simple detail changes everything, because most people use garlic every week and never actually receive the maximum benefit from the compound they are trying to consume. The allicin appears to influence nitric oxide production, endothelial function, vascular flexibility, and oxidative stress. In simple terms, it appears to support the very communication system that aging blood vessels gradually lose. Remember those endothelial cells we talked about earlier? Think of them as tiny biological messengers lining every blood vessel in your body. When they function properly, they send signals that encourage blood vessels to relax. When they become damaged or sluggish, those messages become weaker. The vessels remain tighter, resistance increases, and blood pressure follows. What makes garlic interesting is that it appears to help strengthen that communication pathway. Not overnight, not dramatically, but consistently. and consistency is where meaningful health changes happen. Let me ask you something. Have you ever used garlic for anything besides cooking? I'd genuinely love to know in the comments. What have you heard about it? What have you tried? And what surprised you? One of the reasons I ask is because many people have family traditions involving garlic that were passed down long before modern science caught up. Sometimes those traditions turn out to be more interesting than people realize. Now, before I explain the proper preparation method, I want to stop here for a second because I can already predict what some of you are thinking. This sounds too simple. If it really worked, surely someone would have mentioned it before. Or perhaps you're thinking, if garlic is that helpful, why didn't my doctor tell me? I completely understand that reaction. In fact, early in my career, I had the same reaction whenever patients brought up simple, food-based interventions. But years of working with older adults taught me something important. The most powerful interventions are often not the most complicated. The body is not searching for complexity. It is searching for the right conditions, the right signals, the right environment. And when those conditions are present consistently, remarkable things can happen over time. Not because the body is performing a miracle, because the body is finally being given what it needs to function more effectively. That is exactly why preparation matters, because garlic only works the way researchers describe when it is prepared correctly. This is the part most people never hear. Inside a fresh garlic clove are two separate compounds stored in different compartments. When the clove remains intact, they never interact. But when you crush or finely chop the garlic, those compartments rupture. A reaction begins, and that reaction creates allicin. The problem is that the process takes time, approximately 10 minutes. Most people crush garlic and immediately throw it into a hot pan. Unfortunately, the heat can destroy the enzyme responsible for forming allicin before the process is complete. The flavor remains. Much of the biological activity does not. That is why the preparation method matters so much. Crush or finely chop 1 to 2 cloves of fresh garlic. Set them aside. Walk away. Give them 10 full minutes. Let the reaction complete itself. Then add the garlic near the end of cooking rather than at the beginning. That simple adjustment may be the difference between consuming garlic flavor and consuming meaningful amounts of allicin. And the best part? It takes almost no additional effort. In fact, one patient told me something that made me smile. After following this approach consistently, he said, "This is the easiest thing I've ever done for my health." Not the fastest, not the most dramatic, the easiest. And sometimes easy is exactly what allows a healthy habit to survive long enough to matter. Now, whenever I talk about food and health, I think it is important to separate enthusiasm from evidence. Anecdotes are interesting. Patient experiences are valuable, but neither one replaces research. And that is why I always go looking for the same thing. What happens when scientists put these ideas to the test? This is the part that genuinely excited me when I first read the research. Because the findings were not based on a few people sharing opinions online. They came from researchers asking a very specific question. Can garlic meaningfully influence blood pressure in people who need improvement the most? One review after another began pointing in the same direction. Not that garlic replaces treatment, not that garlic cures hypertension, but that garlic appears capable of supporting healthy blood pressure through multiple biological pathways at the same time. And when several independent mechanisms begin pointing in the same direction, researchers pay attention. One of the things I found particularly interesting was that garlic doesn't appear to work like a medication. A medication often targets one pathway. Garlic appears to influence several. Nitric oxide signaling, oxidative stress, inflammatory activity, vascular flexibility, the health of the endothelium. All of these factors contribute to how blood vessels behave from moment to moment. And that matters because blood pressure is not simply about the amount of blood flowing through the body. It is about the environment the blood encounters as it travels. Think of it this way. Imagine driving down a highway. If the road is smooth, wide, and open, traffic flows naturally. But if the road narrows, becomes damaged, and fills with obstacles, movement becomes more difficult. The vehicles have not changed. The environment has. Blood vessels behave much the same way. Healthy vessels remain flexible, responsive, adaptable. But aging gradually changes the road conditions. The walls become stiffer. Communication becomes weaker. Inflammation quietly accumulates, and blood pressure begins reflecting those changes. This is one reason hypertension becomes more common with age. The body is dealing with decades of accumulated wear and tear. And that brings us back to Robert. Remember, Robert wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for understanding. That distinction is important because people who chase miracles often quit when results are not immediate. People who understand the process tend to stay with it long enough to see meaningful change. I remember reviewing his blood pressure journal several weeks after he began incorporating garlic into his evening meals. What struck me was not one spectacular reading. In fact, if you looked at a single day's numbers, you might have missed the story entirely. The story was in the pattern. The peaks were becoming less dramatic. The fluctuations were becoming less extreme. The readings seemed calmer, more predictable, more stable, and stability is something many people underestimate. When patients talk about improving blood pressure, they often imagine one perfect number appearing on the screen. But what physicians often celebrate first is consistency, because consistency usually arrives before major improvement. The body rarely changes in a straight line. It changes gradually, quietly, almost invisibly at first. That is why so many people abandon healthy habits too early. They stop just before the benefits begin accumulating. Robert nearly made the same mistake. During the second week, he told me he wasn't sure anything was happening. The numbers looked similar, the effort felt the same, and he was beginning to question whether it was worth continuing. I hear this all the time, not just with garlic, with walking programs, with sleep improvements, with healthier diets, with weight loss efforts. People assume that if something is working, the evidence should be immediate. But biology is not a light switch. It is more like a garden. You water it, you care for it, you maintain it, and for a while, nothing appears different. Then one morning, you notice growth that has actually been happening beneath the surface all along. That is exactly how many healthy changes occur inside the body. Long before you see them, long before you feel them. The process is already underway, which is why expectations matter so much. If you decide to use garlic as part of a broader blood pressure strategy, the goal is not to wake up tomorrow with perfect numbers. The goal is to create conditions that favor improvement over time. And that brings me to something I wish more people understood. The healthiest blood pressure strategy is rarely built around one intervention. It is built around several small interventions working together: medication when needed, movement, sleep, stress management, nutrition, and sometimes simple additions that support the body's natural regulatory systems. Garlic fits into that larger picture beautifully, not because it does everything, because it contributes something valuable. And contributions add up, especially when they are repeated day after day. That is why consistency matters more than intensity. A person who uses garlic correctly 3 times and forgets about it for the next month will likely see very little benefit. But a person who incorporates it into a sustainable routine may be creating a very different outcome. And that brings us to the question every viewer eventually asks: what should I realistically expect if I begin today? Not tomorrow, not next month, today. Let's walk through what that journey often looks like over the first 60 days. Now, before we begin, let me make something very clear. What I am about to describe is not a guarantee. It is not a prediction, and it is certainly not a substitute for individualized medical care. Every person is different. Every medical history is different. Every body responds differently. But after years of watching patients make small, sustainable changes, I have noticed patterns, and patterns can be helpful, because they help us replace unrealistic expectations with realistic ones. Let's start with the first week. This is where most people become discouraged, not because anything is wrong, because almost nothing appears to be happening. You crush the garlic. You wait 10 minutes. You add it to your evening meal. You repeat the process the next day, and the next. Then you check your blood pressure. The reading looks familiar, maybe slightly better, maybe exactly the same. And that little voice inside your head begins asking the question it always asks: is this even doing anything? That question has sabotaged more healthy habits than almost anything else. Because people expect visible results before the biological process has had time to unfold. I remember one patient laughing as he told me he checked his blood pressure 3 times on the second day because he was convinced something dramatic should have happened already. Nothing had. And that's exactly what should have happened. Week 1 is not about seeing change. Week 1 is about creating consistency, because consistency is what allows change to happen later. Think about planting a seed. You do not dig it up every morning to see whether roots are forming. You trust the process. The same patience is required here. By the second and third week, something interesting often begins happening, not necessarily in the numbers, in the person. Many people begin paying closer attention to their health overall, and this matters more than most people realize. A person who starts crushing garlic before dinner often begins reading food labels. They become more aware of sodium. They drink a little more water. They take their evening walk more consistently. Healthy habits have a tendency to attract other healthy habits. Researchers sometimes call this a positive spillover effect. I simply call it momentum, and momentum is powerful. Around this point, some people begin noticing that their readings feel less chaotic. Not lower every day, not perfect, but less unpredictable. The dramatic spikes become less frequent. The fluctuations seem less extreme, and perhaps most importantly, the anxiety surrounding the measurement begins to decrease. If you have lived with high blood pressure for years, you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes the stress of checking your blood pressure becomes almost as exhausting as the blood pressure itself. You sit down, wrap the cuff around your arm, press the button, and hold your breath. Waiting, hoping, bracing yourself. Many people never talk about that part, but it is real. I have seen it in hundreds of patients. And one of the first emotional changes many people notice is that they begin approaching the measurement with less fear. Not because everything is suddenly perfect, because the numbers are starting to make more sense. Then we arrive at weeks 4 through 6. This is where many people report the greatest difference. Not dramatic transformation, noticeable stability. And stability is one of the most underrated achievements in cardiovascular health. I remember reviewing another patient's blood pressure journal during this period. For nearly 2 years, his readings looked like a roller coaster. One day high, the next day lower, then unexpectedly high again. The pattern seemed random, but after several weeks of consistent lifestyle changes, including the garlic routine, something changed. The roller coaster began looking more like a gentle wave, still moving, still fluctuating, but calmer. And that calmness matters, because your cardiovascular system thrives on stability. The heart prefers predictability. The arteries prefer predictability. The entire circulatory system functions more efficiently when extreme swings become less common. That is why physicians often celebrate trends before they celebrate milestones, because trends tell us where the body is heading. And by the time we reach day 60, something remarkable often happens, not in the body, in the mind. People begin feeling different about their health. For years, they felt as though blood pressure was something happening to them. Now it feels like something they are actively participating in. That shift is powerful. I once asked a patient what surprised him most after 2 months of following a routine similar to the one we've discussed. I expected him to mention a number. Instead, he smiled and said something I still remember. "This is the first time in years I felt like I had some influence over what was happening." Not control, influence. And sometimes that is where confidence begins, not in perfection, in participation. Because health is rarely about finding one miracle solution. It is about creating enough positive influences that the body begins moving in a healthier direction. That is exactly why garlic deserves attention. Not because it performs magic, not because it replaces medication, not because it works overnight, but because it may support several of the biological systems involved in blood pressure regulation while fitting naturally into everyday life. And when a habit is simple enough to repeat, it becomes powerful. Because repeatable is where lasting health changes live. But before we finish, there is one final misunderstanding about blood pressure that I need to address. And it may be the most important one of all. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is becoming obsessed with a single number, a single morning reading, a single doctor's appointment, a single moment in time. I understand why. Numbers feel concrete. They feel objective. They feel as though they should tell us everything we need to know. But they don't. Blood pressure is not a photograph. It is a movie. And that distinction changes the way you think about your health. Imagine watching only 3 seconds of an entire film and believing you understand the whole story. You wouldn't. You would be missing context, patterns, direction, meaning. The same is true for blood pressure. A reading of 145 one morning tells me very little by itself. What interests me is what happened yesterday, last week, last month. Is the trend improving? Is it becoming more stable? Are the spikes becoming less frequent? Those are the questions that matter. Unfortunately, Many people spend years trapped in a cycle of emotional reactions. A high reading ruins their day. A lower reading makes them feel hopeful. Then another high reading appears, and the cycle starts all over again. It becomes exhausting, not physically, emotionally. I have seen patients carry that burden for years, and often the greatest gift they give themselves is learning to focus on patterns instead of moments, because patterns reveal progress. Moments often create confusion. That brings me back to Robert. Remember the question that brought him into my office? Why is it still going up? At the time, he believed the answer would be complicated. Another medication, another procedure, another restriction. Instead, what he discovered was something surprisingly simple. He had spent years trying to control blood pressure without fully understanding what his blood vessels needed. Once he understood the biology, his decisions became easier. Not perfect, not effortless, but easier. He stopped chasing quick fixes. He stopped looking for dramatic solutions. And he began focusing on small actions that could be repeated every day. That shift changed everything, because consistency beats intensity almost every time. I have seen people adopt extreme diets for 2 weeks and abandon them. I have seen people start exercise programs that were impossible to maintain. I have seen people buy expensive supplements they stopped taking before the bottle was empty. Intensity creates excitement. Consistency creates results. And when I think about the patients who experienced the most meaningful improvements over time, they all had one thing in common. They found habits they could live with, not habits they could survive. There is a difference. A habit you can survive lasts days. A habit you can live with lasts years. That is one reason garlic remains so interesting to me. It doesn't require a complete lifestyle overhaul. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't ask you to become a different person. It simply asks for consistency. 1 or 2 cloves, properly prepared, repeated over time. That is manageable for most people, and manageable habits are often the ones that change lives. I want to stop here and say something that I wish every older adult could hear. If your blood pressure has been difficult to control, it does not mean you have failed. It does not mean you lack discipline. It does not mean your efforts were wasted. Many people are doing the right things and still struggling because nobody has fully explained what is happening inside their bodies. Knowledge changes that. Understanding changes that. And understanding is the first step toward making better decisions. The goal of today's video was never to convince you that garlic is a miracle. The goal was to show you that sometimes the most valuable health tools are hiding in plain sight. Not because they are magical, because they are practical, because they are repeatable, because they work alongside the healthy habits you are already trying to build. And perhaps most importantly, because they remind us that improving health is often less about finding the perfect solution and more about creating the right environment for the body to function at its best. When you think about it that way, blood pressure becomes much less frightening. It becomes something you can influence, something you can monitor, something you can understand. And understanding removes fear. That may be the most important lesson of all, because people who understand their health make better decisions about their health, and better decisions, repeated over time, become better outcomes. That is how meaningful change happens, not overnight, not in one dramatic moment, but through small choices repeated often enough that they begin shaping the future. If you found this video helpful, subscribe to Senior Health Advice and join thousands of older adults who are taking a more informed approach to healthy aging. If you have ever tried garlic for blood pressure, or if you're thinking about trying the preparation method we discussed today, let me know in the comments. Tell me your age and where you're watching from. I genuinely enjoy seeing how many people from around the world are part of this community. And remember, your next blood pressure reading is not your future. It is simply information. What matters most is what you do with that information. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, take good care of yourself.